Do you trust the process? I wanted to talk to you today about trusting the process. And God speaks to me quite often in the early hours of the morning when I'm just waking up. I'll start to get what I kind of consider to be God-inspired thoughts. So this morning I was just, thinking about this idea of trusting the process and how, in life we can be up against different things, and it can be hard to find peace and hard to trust in the process that we're going through. And instantly, I felt the Lord speaking to me, and I remembered the story in Joshua chapter 6 where they're going around the Walls of Jericho. And God started to speak to me about, trusting the process and how those guys had to go around that wall, over the period of a week. And how that is kind of similar to what we go through in our life. We can feel that we go through the same thing and around the same circle so many times, but what we don't realize is that there's a process that God's taking us through. And do we trust that process, and do we trust where God is leading us, and do we trust that there will be an outcome to going around in what we feel are just circles? So I just wanted to read parts of this. So Joshua chapter 6 verse 2, then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horn in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a shout. Then the walls of the city will collapse and the people will go up. Every man will go straight in. Verse 10 goes down to say, all this time the trumpets were sounding. So each time they walked around, the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the people, do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voice until the day I tell you to shout, then shout. Verse 20, when the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. So there's 5 points that I really want to pull out of those few verses that I feel really key to help us move forward and trust the process that we're on. So in verse 2 up at the start, the first thing God did was he gave a promise to Joshua. He said, see, I have delivered. So the Lord, knew that they needed to get into that city. They needed, the supplies, and God was starting to build up Israel. So it hadn't happened in the natural yet, but it was promised. And before God gave any instructions, before they started on any process, he gave them a promise. See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. And I just want to say that, so often God gives us a promise before he gives us the process, and it's up to us to hold on to that promise and to know that, as God says it, so it will be. Number 2 point is after God gave the promise, he gave an instruction to see the promise manifested. So just being aware that God gives us the process. God gave Joshua this process, and Joshua passed it on to the other men and in the tribe. And so what we see is that, that God didn't give everyone the process directly, but sometimes it's passed down to us, and we need to trust that the journey that we're on is led by God, that even if it comes from a point of view of a Joshua in our life, we need to trust that we're a part of that together, and we need to be able to walk on the journey with people as well, and to trust that God will do what he says he will do. So point number 3, trumpets were sounding, but the people were not to speak. So don't speak against the process. I think that's a really important point. So often we can go around and we can feel like we're going around in circles, and all we do is we speak out negativity after negativity after negativity. We feel like we're not going anywhere. God, why aren't you intervening? God, why aren't you doing this? God, where's my promise? And we forget that we are in the process. We forget that God has got us exactly where he wants us, and it's up to us not to speak. Do not speak. Do not be tempted to go against the process that God has us on. We need to keep the vision, and we need to trust the process that God has got us going through. I think that the outcome would have been totally different if that instruction was missed off, the instruction of not to speak. I think that, for these guys going around this city once a day for 6 days, that's a long process. And they were to be silent each time they went around that city. And it was only the trumpets that were sounding. And I think that it's just so key that while there's noise going on around us, that the trumpets can be sounding. We need to keep our focus, and we need to keep our vision, and we need to keep the promises that God has given us, central in our heart, and know the piece of the puzzle that we're playing, and not to get caught up with the sound of the trumpet, and not to get caught up with other people's, part that they're playing in the journey, but know that God has given us a specific process to follow. And then so finally on the 7th day they went around 7 times, and so that was kind of like a speed up process of what they'd gone through the past 6 days. God did everything again all in the one day. And so often, right at the end of our process, things can speed up, and we need to know that that's God doing that. We need to not get cold feet. We need to not start to question and start to doubt, but we just need to recognize that it's part of the process, that things are speeding up, things are starting to happen. We are still to keep silent, and we are still to not speak against the vision and speak against what God has put before us, but just to keep going on with that and go with the flow. So point number 4 is that there was a distinct moment when circumstances changed and the people were to shout. So when you feel the shift, go with it. Don't remain repeating the old instruction. So after they've gone around, for 6 days, on the last 7th day, they went around 7 times. And at the very end, the trumpets gave a loud blast. And it was at that moment that the people had to give a big shout. They had to join their voice together as a collective. And in our lives, there are times when we're going through a process and we can get so comfortable going around that same bush that we don't notice when circumstances have changed and when we're actually called to shout. And what I think a shout is it's when we start to speak out what God has given us. So there's a period of time when God's doing stuff internally, and there's a period of time where it can seem like we're going around and around in circles. But we need to know when God tells us to shout, and when God tells us to come into agreement with what He is saying. We've been in agreement the whole way along, but when we've come to a point where we have to verbally be in agreement, and there is a time in your process when you have to stand up and you have to shout and you have to tell the mountain to move. And there is a push that happens, and that comes from your spirit rising up where you say enough is enough and I am moving forward with the Lord. So it's really important not in that moment not to keep repeating the old instruction, which was to remain silent, but to make sure that you step into the new instruction, which is to speak and to prophesy and to call those things that aren't as if they are. And last point, number 5, the wall collapsed right at that moment. And so every man charged straight in and they took the city. That's what it says. Every man charged straight in and they took the city. So when God opens up the door, go straight in. Do not stop, do not doubt, do not question, do not get cold feet, don't hesitate. When things start to crumble and you know that God is opening a door for you, that is not the time to shrink back. That is the time to run forward as those walls are collapsing. That is the time to run forward and to step fully into what God is calling you into. You need to remember the promise. See, way at the beginning, the first thing that God said to Joshua was, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands." They go through this process, and right at the end, the walls come down and they see Jericho. God hadn't delivered it into their hands yet. The walls came down, but Jericho was still there. The people were still there inside that city. They would have known something was going on. They would have been bearing arms. They would have been wondering what was happening. And if Joshua and his fellow men had hesitated in that time, the people inside of Jericho would have gathered arms and they would have been defeated. They would have, because there's a whole city in there with armor and with, everything they need for war. But no, Joshua and his men went straight in. And so I just want to encourage you just to trust the process and trust the path that God has you on. And remember these 5 points. And remember that when God calls you to go straight in and don't hesitate. And He will deliver Jericho into your hands. So I hope you enjoyed this short video. It's a bit of just what God was speaking to me about this morning, and I found it really helpful, and I hope that you have too. And so don't forget, if you're watching this on YouTube, to hit the subscribe button and to go to www.kylewomen.com. I've got heaps of other resources on there available to encourage you and to inspire you. My heart's desire is that you would see your destiny and that you would live it now. And so on the website there's heaps of things on there really to get connected to a group of like-minded women. And don't forget to subscribe and comment on this video.